Hey everyone, this is Glenn Greenwald. Welcome to a live edition of System Update on our home here on Rumble. And we are going to be spending some time examining all of the implications of the controversy surrounding Australia's deportation earlier, or rather in East Coast time, on Saturday night, Sunday morning, local time in Australia, of the unvaccinated tennis star Novak Djokovic. Now, first of all, this is going to be part of our effort to increase the frequency with which we cover live events. We've done it a few times. It's been a great success. The live that I did, for example, covering the verdict in the Kyle Rittenhouse case was viewed by close to 750,000 people. And the way that it works is it's intended to be interactive. So if you want to have questions or comments, we will be monitoring those in the chat box called Rumble Rants. If you want to donate to our ability to expand our video programming, to do it more frequently, which we're definitely looking to do, especially live coverage, you can do that through the Rumble Rants as well, which will increase the size of the comments and the likelihood I'll be able to see it as it's scrolling. Now, obviously, the question of whether a tennis star is able to play in a tennis tournament on itself is not a very significant episode. And if it were just about that limited question, whether Novak Djokovic was able to play in the 2022 Australian Open despite being unvaccinated, I certainly wouldn't be spending time covering it. I'm not a tennis reporter. I'm not a sports reporter. There are lots of sports and tennis implications to it. I actually do pay a lot of attention to tennis, just as someone who has always been a fan of tennis, but not a sports journalist. It's not something that I would cover simply for the sports implications, but it actually has consequences far, far beyond the tennis court or the world of sports. And that's the reason why I wanted to do a live broadcast about this breaking news that occurred as a result of a judicial hearing, the entirety of which I watched last night, again, Sunday morning in Australia, Saturday night on the East Coast of the United States. And I wanted to talk to you about the ruling by the Australian authorities, the ruling by the court that upheld that, and then his deportation that took place earlier this morning, Sunday morning, on the East Coast. Now, in order to understand what happened here, because there are a lot of misconceptions, I see huge numbers of people, especially people thrilled to watch Novak Djokovic be sent packing because they want to see people who are unvaccinated punished and humiliated for reasons having a lot to do with psychology, a lot to do with in-group behavior, very little to do with science or public health. For the people who are cheering what was done, I'm seeing massive fundamental misconceptions about the basis for this decision, about the precedents that it sets, about the principles that were invoked. And for that reason, I want to walk you through the timeline and make clear exactly what it is that took place here, because in order to talk about the implications, you first need to know what happened. And as I said, if it weren't very significant beyond the world of sports, beyond the question of whether a tennis player gets to play in the Australian Open, I wouldn't be talking about this precisely because it is much more significant, though. I want to. It really shows a lot about what is happening in the West 2 years into this pandemic, a full year into virtual universal availability for the vaccine, at least in Western countries. And yet there's continuing craving for increased state power and for the punishment of people who aren't complying and obeying. And I think a lot of these things are very disturbing in ways that will endure for a long time to come, not just in the COVID pandemic, but beyond that as well. Now, as many of you know, I interviewed a different tennis player, the American professional tennis player, Tennis Sandgren, on Wednesday here at Rumble. And I really encourage you to watch that interview if you haven't already seen it. Like Djokovic, Tennis Sandgren is a tennis player who chose not to be vaccinated. Unlike Djokovic, though, he decided that he wouldn't even try to get into Australia. He wouldn't try and play in the Australian Open, even though Australia has been and continues to be crucial to his tennis career and the success of it. By choosing not to go to Australia, he really did put his tennis career at risk. But he decided that his personal right to object to tennis, to vaccine mandates, and his right to make his own decision about what to put in his body, not to allow foreign governments to dictate that to him, was such an important principle that he would be willing to risk his career, as he just did, in order not to go play in Australia if the only way he could go play was by obeying the vaccine mandate. Now, Novak Djokovic made a different choice. He also decided that getting a vaccine that he obviously doesn't want wasn't worth the price of playing in the Australian Open. But what he did instead was, under Australian law, it's actually not a requirement in order to enter Australia to be vaccinated. You have to either be vaccinated or demonstrate that you are eligible for one of the exemptions to the vaccine. And so Novak Djokovic didn't just show up in Australia 7 days ago demanding to be let in, despite the fact that it's a requirement to be vaccinated. It's not a requirement to be vaccinated. There are exemptions available. He applied for one of those exemptions. 2 separate medical boards evaluated his medical records that he submitted and concluded that he was eligible for the exemption under Australian law, that he was able under the law to enter Australia despite being unvaccinated. Specifically, that exemption was that he just contracted COVID 3 weeks ago in mid-December. He had a positive test on December 16th for COVID, which is at least the second time that we know of that he contracted COVID. His negative test was returned on December 22nd. So he contracted the virus, cleared the virus from his system, which means that he has natural immunity. And therefore, the risk that he will contract the virus while he's in Australia or transmit it to other people is virtually zero. It's negligible. And therefore, 2 separate boards of medical professionals created by the state concluded that he was not a threat to the public health and could therefore enter Australia safely. As a result of that ruling, Australia granted him a visa to enter the country, informed him of that decision. He got on a plane and flew from Dubai, first from Spain, where he was training, to Dubai, and then Dubai to Australia, thinking that he had now a right to enter Australia. While he was flying from Dubai to Australia, the Australian population learned that he had been given an exemption by the government. And the Australians have been probably the most locked down and repressed people on the planet under COVID protocols over the last 2 years. Certainly in the democratic or the Western world, they have been. At times, for long periods of time, they were barred from even traveling from one state to another within their own country. The lockdowns have been severe. Many of them are extremely angry. But for some reason, instead of directing that anger at their government that has been a real outlier in depriving people's liberty in the name of preventing COVID, they displaced that anger from the government onto this tennis player who they decided was the real villain. And the rage that they felt after being locked down for 2 years, that this rich, famous tennis player was going to be able to waltz into their country as they saw it, despite being unvaccinated, was so intense that the Australian government, which granted Novak Djokovic the visa in the first place, started making clear that once he got to the border, there was a good chance they would refuse to let him in, even though they had given him a visa. So it was never about concerns over the public health or science. It was purely political. The Scott Morrison government, who's the Prime Minister of Australia, has an election this year that will be very heavily contested, and he was facing public backlash over the fact that they had let in Novak Djokovic to play in the Australian Open. And so because of that political pressure and the impending election, they decided they were going to do everything possible to prevent him from getting in. Djokovic arrived in Australia at 1 a.m, 7 or 8 days ago, with his visa. He was detained by the Border Patrol, questioned for many hours, kept in a detention room, and was finally told at 6:30 a.m. that his visa was being revoked and that he would have no right to enter the country. He was asking for them to wait until 8:30 in the morning for him to be able to call his lawyers or him to be able to call the organizers of the tournament that had arranged for his exemption. They refused. They simply nullified his visa. They brought him to a hotel that is used for detaining asylum seekers or for other people who are deemed without legal authority to enter the country. And while he was kept there, he hired lawyers. The lawyers contested the denial of his visa at the border, and a judge last Monday ruled in his favor, ruled that the Border Patrol had been unreasonable and irrational and unfair in the procedures they used to ban him from entering the country. So his visa was reinstated. He was allowed to enter the country. He proceeded to go to the tennis stadium and begin to train. And for 4 or 5 days, the question was, would the immigration minister use his own separate discretion, his own separate authority to revoke Djokovic's visa and order him deported on the grounds that he was not vaccinated? And day after day, Djokovic was training. There was no decision. And then finally, late Friday afternoon, the Australian Immigration Minister Alex Hawke announced that he was using his power to nullify and cancel Djokovic's visa and ordering that his deportation take place. Now, his reason for doing that, and this is what's so important, this is what has been wildly misunderstood. The argument that was made by the immigration minister when ordering Djokovic's visa revoked and ordering him deported was not that Djokovic poses a threat to the public health by virtue of being unvaccinated. Quite the contrary, the government acknowledged the reality that Djokovic had a positive COVID test just 3 weeks ago and therefore carries with him enormous amounts of antibodies and other forms of natural immunity that make it virtually impossible or highly unlikely that he would contract COVID and transmit it to anybody else during the 2 weeks that he wanted to stay in Australia. They acknowledged that he was not a threat to the public health. They also acknowledged that there's no legal requirement to be vaccinated in order to enter Australia. They acknowledged instead that the visa that he received was a legally valid visa, that he fell within the legally created exemption for being vaccinated, namely that he had contracted COVID recently and therefore had natural immunity, and that he therefore entered the country legally with a valid visa. Those are incredible concessions to make. He's in the country. The government acknowledges that he's not a threat to the public health and acknowledges that he entered the country legally on a legal visa that they themselves issued. Which then leads to the question, why is it then that they declared his visa nullified or rescinded the visa and ordered him deported? And the rationale that the minister gave, which he was required under the law to provide when ruling that this person should be deported, was quite amazing. The argument was that by virtue of his previously stated views about vaccines that he had expressed in April 2020, almost 2 full years ago, on a Facebook Live before there was even a COVID vaccine, by virtue of his skepticism that he had expressed in that live about vaccines in general and about the fairness of forcing people to be vaccinated who don't want to be, that he would be a threat to the public order because his presence in Australia presented a risk that he might, quote, excite anti-vaccine sentiment. So the reason for the revocation of his visa and the reason he was ordered to be deported, despite coming to Australia for no reason other than to participate in a tennis tournament that he has won 9 times in the past 12 years that it was held. 12 years in a row it has been held. He has won it 9 times. He's the number 1 tennis player in the world. They decided that he should be deported because of his political opinions that he had expressed in a very tepid way back in April of 2020 about vaccines generally before there was even a vaccine available. And that is what makes this so significant. And the fact that people are cheering it makes it so chilling. That the government has punished Novak Djokovic, has decided he should be deported, forcibly deported, preventing him from pursuing his livelihood, not on the grounds that his being unvaccinated means that he's a threat to the public health, but the fact that he has expressed political opinions about vaccines that they regard as dangerous. The opinions themselves are dangerous. Now, before I get into why this is so dangerous, and it's not just me saying that this is dangerous, it is immigration lawyers, people who represent immigrants trying to enter Australia, or human rights activists in Australia who are warning of how dangerous this precedent that just got upheld was, not just for Australia, but the West generally. Not exactly people renowned for being hard right activists, immigration lawyers and human rights activists. These are people typically associated with the left. But like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK and Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, the French leftists, they are warning that an authoritarian framework is being implemented 2 years into the pandemic based on concepts that are completely divorced from science or the public health. So before I get into those rationale, I just want to give you a little bit of the flavor from a sports perspective about why what was done was so significant. Novak Djokovic is, as I said, the number one tennis player on the planet. He has been that for many years. He is arguably the greatest player ever to play in the history of the sport. The two competitors for that title happen to be his contemporaries, which is one of the amazing things about men's tennis. Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer are both also talked about, along with Djokovic, as being the greatest players ever to play the sport of tennis. And it's amazing that they have played contemporaneously. All three of them currently have the same number of Grand Slam titles, 20. So Djokovic is going to Australia, gave him the opportunity to break the all-time record for a number of Grand Slams won by any tennis player in men's history, 21, and to move into the lead, the all-time lead for a number of Grand Slams won for any player. It could have been a really historic moment for Australia, for the tournament, for Djokovic, for tennis fans. But instead, the government just deported him and ruled that he cannot participate or even be in the country because they don't like his political views that he tepidly expressed back in April of 2020. That's what makes this so chilling. Now, here's the New York Times article on the hearing, which I watched in its entirety. It was 5 to 6 hours long last night. You see there, this is from this morning's New York Times article that reads, Novak Djokovic leaves Australia after losing his bid to stay. And the article summarizes what happened. Novak Djokovic's last attempt to salvage his hopes of defending his Australian Open title has failed, with judges ruling on Sunday that Australia's immigration minister was within his rights to cancel the unvaccinated tennis star's visa for a second time on the basis of the player could pose a risk to public health and order. The judge's decision cannot be appealed. Now, let me just emphasize here that the decision to revoke Djokovic's visa and order him deported was made by the immigration minister, facing a lot of political backlash. What the judges made clear in their ruling was that basically their hands were tied. They really have almost no authority to reverse the immigration minister's decision. Their ability to review it is extremely limited. The power of the immigration minister to deport a non-citizen from Australian soil is virtually absolute. You essentially have to prove that it was completely arbitrary and for malicious ends. There was no conceivable rationale, which of course you can't prove. The judges made clear that by ruling and upholding this deportation order, they were not in any way expressing agreement with the rationale offered by the immigration minister. They were simply saying that under the law, it is he who has the power to make this decision and not those judges. So it wasn't a judicial endorsement of the decision, but really basically a recognition that under Australian law, the immigration minister has all but absolute authority to order people deported for whatever reason he wants. Now, as I mentioned, this has been very controversial, not among the Australian people, who overwhelmingly said they want Novak Djokovic gone from their country. They don't want anyone unvaccinated in their country. As draconian as many of us in the West have viewed Australia's reaction to COVID, in many ways, it has been popular. The Australian people seem to really crave extreme forms of freedom deprivation in the name of COVID. They've watched the same video of camps and hard quarantines that we've all seen, and they're happy with it. They're grateful. Even Australian leftists and liberals I've seen expressing gratitude to the center-right government and specifically the hardline immigration minister for, quote, keeping them safe, as though Novak Djokovic is a threat to them in any way. What's actually happening in Australia right now is the same thing that's happening in many countries around the world. Australia is a very, very vaccinated country. 95% of the adult population is vaccinated, fully vaccinated. And yet the Omicron variant is running wild throughout Australia, including Melbourne, which is where the tournament is being held. They have the highest number of cases that they've had since the beginning of the pandemic. Obviously, vaccinated people are with great frequency contracting and transmitting the virus. In fact, a vaccinated stranger would likely be far more of a danger to you if you're an Australian than Novak Djokovic, given that we know that he just got COVID 3 weeks ago and is very, very, very unlikely to get it again while he's in Australia. And yet, Australians seem thrilled by it, but there are people who aren't thrilled by it, this decision. And that is, as I said, immigration lawyers, people who represent immigrants for a living, and human rights activists in Australia who are warning that if you're cheering for the deportation of Novak Djokovic, you are cheering for and empowering some very authoritarian dynamics. Here is an article in the Australian Age by a reporter, Paul Sackle, who has covered the Djokovic controversy continuously from the start, the title of which is, quote, "Dangerous in a Democracy. Civil Rights Groups Alarm at Government's Djokovic Case." The article reads, quote, "Civil rights proponents say one of the Morrison government's key reasons for deporting Novak Djokovic was weak and could create a precedent to block travelers with undesirable political views who pose no real risk to the community. Lawyers for Immigration Minister Alex Hawke relied on comments made by the tennis world number one in April 2020, before COVID-19 vaccines were even created, in which he said Novak Djokovic did, quote, he was, quote, opposed to vaccination, but he acknowledged, quote, he was no expert and, quote, had an open mind and wanted, quote, an option to choose what's best for my body. That is the totality of what Djokovic said in April of 2020. In general, I'm opposed to vaccination, but I'm not an expert. I have an open mind. I want to see if these vaccinations get here, what they are. And basically, all I'm advocating for is an option to choose for myself. I don't want to be forced. That was the sum total of what he said 2 years ago, almost, that the Australian government used as their sole basis for ruling that he was a dangerous presence in Australia. That was it. And that's why these civil rights activists are so alarmed. Pauline Wright, president of the NSW Council for Civil Liberties, said it was reasonable for a government to suggest a famous person such as Djokovic, who is unvaccinated, may influence some people to refuse inoculation. Although, remember, Australia has a 95% rate of vaccination, so there's hardly an unvaccinated population there. But she said it was a, quote, big leap to argue that his previous comments on vaccination were serious enough to deem his presence in Australia a public health risk. Do the comments in 2020 disentitle him from playing a tennis game in Australia in 2022, she said? Does that really pose such a threat to public health in a situation where we've got 95% of the adult population vaccinated? People are free to be skeptical of vaccination, she said, in a comment that should not be controversial. You should be allowed, especially before the vaccine is even available, to say that you're skeptical about the ability of it to work. There were a lot of Democrats in the United States, including Kamala Harris, who were saying that she would be very skeptical about a vaccine developed under the Donald Trump presidency, that she'd be very reluctant even to take it. That's all he was saying was, I'm skeptical of vaccines. I'm not sure I want to take it, and I definitely don't want to be forced. And here's a civil liberties activist, not a hard right, far right activist, saying people are free to be skeptical of vaccination. It's just a matter of free thought. As long as they can prove they are COVID free, I don't see why they should be excluded from public life. Why should you be excluded from public life if the government acknowledges that you're COVID free because you just got COVID 3 weeks ago and you're willing to submit to whatever testing regime they want to impose on you? How in any way are you a threat by virtue of the opinions you've expressed 2 years ago about vaccines? Here's another civil rights activist, quote, Australian Lawyers Alliance spokesman Greg Barnes, a barrister experienced in migration cases, so he's an immigration lawyer, said the government would be justified in blocking Djokovic if he was coming to Australia to spur anti-vaccination views. Quote, but he's coming here to play tennis, and his views on vaccination are somewhat muddled, he said. So he's saying, look, if Djokovic were coming to Australia to rile up anti-vaccine sentiment, to hold rallies against vaccines, to encourage people not to be vaccinated, that would be one thing. Maybe the government can say, well, we don't want foreigners coming onto our soil to engage in activism that we think is harmful. But that's not what he's there for. Everyone knows that he's not coming to do that. He's coming to play in a tennis tournament that he's played in for the last 15 years without ever once harming anybody. The lawyer goes on, Mr. Barnes said the case could hypothetically set a precedent for a musician to be blocked if they were well known for opposing the U.S.-Australia alliance on the basis the person might diminish public support for a pillar of Australian foreign policy national security. Think about that. Australia recently entered into a somewhat controversial national security alliance, military alliance with the United States. It caused a lot of conflict with France and Germany and other NATO allies for a lot of complicated reasons. But it's part of the United States' effort to create a check against the threat that they see from China. It's controversial in the world. It's controversial in Australia. And what if somebody who's a musician had a concert in Australia and they said, I regard this U.S.-Australian alliance as ill-advised? This would mean that the government could say somebody who expresses their opinion that this alliance, this military alliance, is ill-advised, is now a danger to be on Australian soil because it might incite a sentiment among the people that we don't like, an opinion that we disagree with. So we're going to ban them from coming in, or if they get in, we're going to deport them and prevent them from earning their livelihood. Who would want this precedent where you can now be deported, not if you're a criminal, not if you're doing things that pose a threat to other people, but if you're expressing political opinions that the current government happens to regard as dangerous. The article goes on. The government initially blocked Djokovic's visa on the basis he did not have a valid medical exemption. But its second visa cancellation was underpinned by the new rationale that he was a risk to public health and good order based on his vaccine skepticism. There's the picture of Djokovic being taken into detention when the government first revoked his visa. Now, as I said, I believe that this case creates a lot of serious precedent well beyond the question of whether Djokovic gets to try and win his 21st Grand Slam title. I do think it's very dangerous, the specific precedent I just reviewed as expressed by Australian immigration lawyers and civil liberties activists and civil rights activists that we're now saying to the government, if people in a pandemic just are skeptical of what you're telling them to do, that means that you get to now treat them as lepers, as threats to the public order by virtue of their opinion, and that their livelihood will be denied. Obviously, no one's concerned about Novak Djokovic's financial loss. He's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Obviously, he's set financially for life. But most people aren't, including other tennis players like the one that I interviewed on Wednesday, Tennis Sandgren, who has career earnings of $3 million. After you subtract all the expenses that he incurs, he has no sponsors and taxes, and acknowledge the fact that athletes stop earning based on their skill at 32 or 34 or 36. Then you're talking about people who don't really have financial security. You're talking about interfering and jeopardizing their ability to earn a living. But what about people who can't afford the best lawyers in Australia the way Djokovic did and fight a government that has unlimited resources? Those people are going to be completely vulnerable to the view that if they express political opinions, it means that they're now deportable or classifiable as a threat to national security, has just happened to him. People are cheering the deportation on the grounds that the unvaccinated pose a threat, even though that's not the reason the Australian government cited in order to justify the deportation. They only cited the danger, not of his health, but of his political opinions. But I think the broader implication is the more serious one here, which is, as I said, we are now almost 2 full years into sustained serious and previously unimaginable disruptions to the normalcy of our lives, to the ability of our children to go to school, the ability of college students to do what is central to their emotional and intellectual and psychological development, which is leave their house and form adult relationships for the first time in a college setting. The ability of people to work. It's destroyed a huge number of businesses all over the world. It's empowered the largest corporations, Amazon and Google, and billionaires and oligarchical wealth have all consolidated their power and wealth while everybody else suffers. And it has given the government the ability to rule by emergency decree for almost 2 years now with no end in sight. What is the end to any of this? And each time something like this happens and people cheer instead of standing up and protesting because they want to see those who have disobeyed be humiliated and punished. I think people clearly enjoy seeing somebody break who refused like they did to comply with what they were told to do, who see the world differently. There's something in us, some kind of sadism, some in-group quest for power that we want to see people ostracized and humiliated and punished and scorned and sanctioned and denied the right to earn a living if they're in any way heterodox or dissidents from the herd. There's clearly a strong psychological dynamic and impulse at play here. But I think what is even more disturbing is that 2 years into a pandemic, we're increasing our willingness for governments to claim more power in the name of the public health, not decreasing it. Even though we were told early on in the pandemic that these lockdowns were just temporary, a few weeks, maybe a couple months to flatten the curve. Nobody remembers that because none of that ever happened. We flattened the curve, and yet those restrictions remained. Even though a vaccine, which we were told for a full year was our way out of this pandemic, is now freely available and universally available in the West and is clearly effective, at least in my view, to preventing serious illness and hospitalization and death, even if it's no longer effective, if it ever was, in preventing people from contracting and transmitting the disease. So the world has gotten better. The variant has gotten less dangerous. There's now a vaccine. We know more about how to treat COVID. There are now effective treatments, including monoclonal antibody treatments and other forms of treatments available. So the world is getting much better from a COVID perspective. And yet it's almost like our desire to empower governments is getting more and more intensified. And our craving never to return to normalcy is being more and more implanted as this pandemic continues to age. And I think what's really happening here is that we're being trained to think that our role, our duty as citizens, whenever the government claims some kind of an emergency, whenever the government claims like there's some kind of a crisis, that they need certain powers to keep us safe, that our duty as citizens is simply to obey and acquiesce. And anybody who stands up and asks questions, anybody who stands up and expresses skepticism, anybody who stands up and expresses concern, who argues that there's a cost to our freedom being restricted, not just the cost to the disease, is increasingly looked at as a person who is a villain, a threat, almost a vector of disease, even though there's nothing in the science or the public health that justify it. And at the end of the day, that is the moral of what happened here. For so long, what we were told was our only duty was to follow the science. The science should dictate everything we do in the pandemic, not politics or passions or tribalism or politics or anything else like that. And what happened in this case is the purest expression of the complete separation between COVID policy and thought on the one hand and science on the other. Because there's nobody who thinks that Novak Djokovic presents a threat to the people of Australia. The government did not even claim that, despite his being unvaccinated. Nobody could claim that, even if it were the case that he hadn't gotten COVID 3 weeks ago. Imagine that you're somebody who, even if you're triple vaccinated, you're nonetheless very worried about COVID. I don't know why you would be. I personally believe the vaccine works. So I don't know why vaccinated people would be worried about COVID still, but assume that you are neurotic about COVID and you need to get on an airplane or a train or a crowded restaurant, enter a crowded restaurant, and there's somebody nearby you that you don't know, Novak Djokovic, let's say. What is it that you would want to know about that person to assuage your neurosis? Would it matter to you if they showed you that they were vaccinated? It shouldn't, since we know that people who are fully vaccinated can easily contract and pass the vaccine to you. That shouldn't be any assurance whatsoever. Whether someone's vaccinated or not does not determine if they're a threat to you or not. Maybe it did a year ago or 9 months ago in the world of another variant. I don't think it ever did. But for sure now, with the ease of vaccinated people and the frequency of vaccinated people transmitting the virus to others, it definitely is an irrelevant metric for knowing if the person next to you is a threat, whether they're vaccinated or not. The only conceivable document that you might want to see from that person sitting next to you is a negative COVID test, a PCR test that was obtained within the last 24 hours or the last 6 hours, however neurotic you might be. There's no scientific rationale for looking at the unvaccinated as dangerous any longer, which means there's no scientific rationale for demanding that the unvaccinated be ostracized from society, be denied the right to freely travel, be denied the right to earn a living. We went from waking up at 7 a.m. to applaud public health workers from our windows in April and May and June of 2020 to 2022 when we decide we want to fire them in the middle of a pandemic because some of them choose not to be vaccinated, that we want to deprive them of their jobs in the middle of a pandemic because they made a different choice than the one we think they should make for themselves about their own health. These are highly authoritarian impulses that are growing, not diminishing, as the pandemic unfolds. And I think this episode, not just because of the impulses it reveals and nurtures, but also because of the precedents it set, is one of the more dangerous ones we've seen yet. Watching so many bloodthirsty people take so much pleasure in watching authoritarian ministers of the government of Australia force this person out of their country as though he's some kind of an evil threat. Again, not because he's unvaccinated, but because he expressed skepticism about vaccination 2 years ago, is a really ugly episode to witness. And yet that's what we just witnessed. And I can assure you that people standing up and saying that they're uncomfortable with what happened here in Australia are definitely in the minority when it comes to Western opinion. And that's the reason to be most concerned of all. So for those of you who came and participated, we've been monitoring the chats. We see the kind of most frequent questions being asked. I feel like I covered most of them, if not all of them. Obviously, it's impossible to respond to each of them, but I feel like Rumble is a really good medium for producing content like this, especially live content. The number of viewers that are now on Rumble is extremely significant. As I said, programs that I've done on Rumble are getting larger audiences than primetime CNN or MSNBC shows. And as anger over big tech repression grows, as censorship by Google and by Facebook continue to intensify, the venues that are devoted to protecting and guaranteeing free speech, like Rumble, like Substack, where I write, like Callin, the app where I do podcasts, are only going to get more popular. People don't trust, nor should they, online venues or venues of information dissemination that are being heavily policed and censored by centralized authority. Rumble is very valuable because it lets people engage in free debate without executives of tech companies arrogating into themselves the power to decree what is true and what is false on complex political, technological, and scientific questions. So Rumble is growing very rapidly. The number of views that our most viewed programs here have attracted demonstrate that. And for that reason, we are going to continue to devote as many resources as we can to covering events live, to doing more video content, because there's just no reason why you should feel imprisoned when a news event happens to go listen to Anderson Cooper or Joe Scarborough or Rachel Maddow or even people on Fox who seem to be more partisan than independent. There are a lot of independent voices online, people who are independent journalists who are free to say what they want. And I think what people are concluding is that those are the voices most trustworthy. So thank you again for watching. It was really enjoyable to be able to cover it in this way. And we will definitely be doing a lot more of these and hope to see you in the future.